Welcome to Doppelnamers, where we connect the dots between people who share the same name. My name is Elizabeth Russell, and this is the story of my doppelnamer, a pioneer named Elizabeth Russell, who was tried for murder in Eau Claire, Wisconsin in 1892. At the time, it was the most famous murder trial in Wisconsin's history. With me are my good friends Mary Jean Stead and Kathy Boyle Almeida. Neither MJ nor Kath knows anything about the story. They will be meeting the characters and hearing the facts right along with the listeners. We'll get to the story in just a moment, but first, as always, we share somebody else's doppelnamer story. And today we meet the mayor of Mason, Michigan, Russ Whipple.
Mr. Whipple.
Of course, by the time you're listening, Russ Whipple might not be the mayor anymore, but as we record today in the summer of 2023, he is. Mason is the county seat of Ingham County, Michigan, where Michigan's capital is located. Do you know the capital of Michigan?
Lansing.
Yes. So MJ, you and I are Hamilton fans.
Yes.
So you know how in Hamilton, Jefferson and Madison negotiated for the nation's capital to be moved from New York to a spot closer to Virginia?
Mm-hmm.
Well, I'm not sure who was in the room where it happened, but something similar went down in Michigan. In 1836, a speculator named Charles Noble acquired land in central Michigan and founded the town of Mason, knowing that Michigan was about to become a state and figuring they'd be picking a centrally located spot for the capital. He was right, but sad for Charles, Michigan chose nearby Lansing instead of Mason. So close. Charles got the consolation prize, though, and Mason became the county seat. Well, in 1877, greedy Lansing tried to make itself the county seat as well as the capital.
Oh, boy.
But that's when we don't know who got together in the room where it happened and struck a deal so that Mason could keep being the county seat. As a result, says Wikipedia, Michigan is the only state in the country with a capital city that is not also the county seat. Okay.
Good fact.
So among Mason's famous citizens is Malcolm X. In 2022 and 2023, a city council member asked Mayor Russ Whipple to establish a Malcolm X Day of Observance by proclamation. Mayor Whipple repeatedly refused. When the council member introduced a resolution instead for the city council to establish such a day, that motion was also defeated. This led to a big pile of discord in Mason, Michigan. And at its center is the mayor, Russ Whipple. Later in our episode, we're going to meet Russ Whipple's doppelnamer.
Oh, okay.
And I'll tell you right now that the Russ Whipple in our story played center stage in an outrageous caper you are not going to believe.
Oh, boy. Outrageous caper. I'm ready.
Very intrigued.
Let's get to it.
Last time, we learned that a month or so after Bertha Erickson was buried, her husband Peter Erickson suddenly suspected foul play and requested an autopsy. We doubt this was Peter's original idea. More likely, it was Bertha's father, John Jensen, who planted the idea in Peter's head, and it was almost certainly William Frawley, the ambitious 29-year-old district attorney, who convinced John Jensen to stir the pot. So Peter made this request, and then a coroner's jury of 6 local men was convened for the autopsy in the barn, which was called an inquest of the dead. Bertha's body was dug up, now for the second time, because recall Ed Erickson, Peter's brother, and his buddies had dug her up 5 days after burial just to see if she was really dead.
Oh, God.
Now, this time, the second time, it wouldn't be right to use any kind of official term like exhumed. Bertha's body was just crudely dug up by Peter's brothers, Ed and Adam Erickson. And they, along with John Jensen, this is important, they had custody of Bertha's remains prior to the inquest. So they just dug her up and held on to her.
In their house or in the barn?
We don't know. All I know from the records that I've seen is they used the term the remains were in their custody. I don't know where. I don't know for how long.
All right.
All I know is there was nothing official about this.
Yeah. Oh, gosh.
All right. So last time we went through all the grisly details of the inquest, which, as you recall, took place in a barn, resulting in the coroner's jury's verdict that Bertha met her death by arsenic poisoning and that the arsenic had been administered to Bertha by Elizabeth Russell. We are not aware of any actual evidence linking Elizabeth Russell to the arsenic that was found in Bertha's stomach.
Can there be fingerprints on one's stomach?
Now, there's a question. We're going to need an expert for that one. Well, remember this. The chain of custody for the jar containing Bertha's stomach is just laughingly suspect. The stomach itself was in the custody of William Frawley's buddy, Dr. Lyman, and one of Frawley's goons took a random bottle of fluid, saying it was fluid from Bertha's stomach, to the local druggist for an arsenic test. Now, anything could have been in that bottle, right? All right, I'm getting too excited here.
I know.
Yeah, we have to remain objective.
That's right.
Okay, so I'm not saying there's no evidence linking Elizabeth to the arsenic in Bertha's stomach, because it's possible that not all of the inquest evidence was preserved. But I can say there is no mention of any evidence like that in any of the newspaper accounts or in any of the documents that I've seen. And the public didn't seem at all troubled by this lack of evidence, because Elizabeth Russell being a murderer is a very exciting story.
They need some news.
They were all for it because it was fun.
Oh, boy.
The newspapers went wild and made buttloads of money just selling papers because of this. So here's some examples. Here's an article from the Burlington Free Press. Headline: "The woman was poisoned."
Oh, gosh.
The article says, the coroner's jury at Eau Claire brought in a verdict that Mrs. Bertha Erickson came to her death by poison administered by Mrs. Elizabeth Russell. Mrs. Erickson, who was only 17 years old and had been married but a few weeks, died April 1st at the home of Mrs. Russell, where she and her husband boarded. The body was buried, but at the insistence of her husband was exhumed a short time ago. The stomach was found to contain arsenic. All right, that is fairly factual.
And they used exhumed.
And they used exhumed. Yes. But now here's another newspaper clipping from the Chippewa Herald Telegram. What an unruly beast jealousy is.
Wow.
Mrs. Elizabeth Russell of Eau Claire, the wife of a respected man, is charged with poisoning Mrs. Bertha Erickson through the influence of that unchained evil spirit, jealousy.
Oh, my God. Wow. This paper is like the Inquirer.
And in this case, there was no honest reason for being possessed of the passion, except that Mrs. Erickson's husband worked for Mr. Russell for a number of years, and an unlawful passion may have been conceived for him by his employer's wife. What? Like, where did that come from?
Nothing has changed that much.
But where do you think it came from?
Oh.
Who would have been the leak?
Oh.
Who's the DA?
Yes, Frawley, because
Frawley.
we'll see later that William Frawley was not above manipulating the press.
Uh-oh.
There is testimony about him planting stories in order to sway public opinion in his favor. So as to this particular story, I don't know where it came from, and I can't say that William Frawley was the source, but it's not an unreasonable leap to speculate that he might have had something to do with it.
Not good.
And one other thing. And another thing. Remember last time we learned that inquests are investigations. They're not supposed to be accusatory. A person still needs to be arrested and formally charged if they are to be prosecuted for a crime. Well, that article about jealousy, the unruly beast, says that Elizabeth had been charged with poisoning Bertha. But in fact, that's not the case.
No.
The
Huh.
inquest had concluded that Elizabeth poisoned Bertha, but that's not the same as being formally charged with a crime. So what do you think happened next?
But did that raise any eyebrows in the law enforcement communities?
Well, all we can do is speculate based on the documents that we have and the information
Yeah.
that we have. But so far, the legal community that we know about was not big on integrity. So here we are. The inquest decided that she did it. The newspapers want her to have done it because it sells papers. The
Right.
public doesn't really care. They just want to be entertained. So what do you think actually did happen next?
Well, it seems like someone would have to actually go interrogate Elizabeth.
Or arrest her.
Exactly.
get
That would
arrested.
be the next step, Kath, right?
Yeah.
Well, what happened next was nothing. And then nothing. And then more nothing.
Oh, weird.
Elizabeth was not arrested. She's home, sleeping in her own bed, living her life pretty much as usual. Like nothing happened. And the scandal obsessed public was super disappointed.
Oh, yeah.
No.
A follow-up article in the Chippewa Herald Telegram proclaimed, "Peculiar case indeed. All kinds of rumors about the Erickson tragedy." And here's the text of that article. A jury of inquest on the 26th of May said that Mrs. Bertha Erickson came to her death from the effects of arsenical poison and that the poison was administered by Elizabeth Russell. Blah, blah. We've heard that several times. And then it goes on to say, and the public generally have since that time speculated considerably as to why Mrs. Russell was not arrested forthwith. The days have passed by. Mrs. Russell engaged lawyers, which she did, and yet the expected arrest has not occurred. This state of affairs has only served to deepen public interest in the case. The impression is beginning to get out that the case will not be prosecuted and that no arrest will be made. There is, however, no good ground for this supposition. Doubtless the authorities have some definite plan in view, although nothing as to their intentions can be learned.
Oh, wow.
Nothing, nothing, nothing. Why do you think there was no arrest?
Does Elizabeth's husband have some sway in the community?
I don't know the answer to that.
He was a respected man.
He was a respected man. That was important to say. But he was also, as we know, a perpetually absent man.
I don't know.
Well, the usual reason for no arrest is there's no evidence.
There's that.
Guess they didn't find the fingerprints on the stomach.
No.
Now, jump back a few episodes. Do you remember who William Carson is?
Oh, yeah. See the road named after him?
Close. When he was a kid, he walked on the road. He's the lumber baron who employed Elizabeth's husband, Thomas.
Okay.
Well, William Carson wrote a letter to the newspaper sticking up for Elizabeth,
All right.
in which he said, Attorney Frawley has said that the reason he did not have Mrs. Russell arrested was that he had no evidence against her. I make these statements in the interest of fair play.
All right.
Yeah, so
Thank
somebody's
you.
sticking up for her.
Right.
The inquest verdict, as we said, issued on May 26th. 1891, and very shortly after that, Elizabeth hired a lawyer, as a person would.
Yeah.
And she retained an attorney named Vincent W. James, who had previously served as city attorney for the city of Eau Claire. Now, as it turned out, after the inquest, the Justice of the Peace, N.C. Wilcox, remember him? He was the IRS booze inspector. Anyway, right after the inquest, he actually issued a warrant for Elizabeth's arrest right away, but it was never executed. As we said, nothing happened,
Right.
nothing happened, and nothing happened until December.
Oh, that's a long way.
Right. So 6 months later, on December 3rd, 1891, Elizabeth Russell was in fact arrested at her home and taken
Wow.
to the county jail. Before I tell you what happened next, let's go back to a character we met in episode 2, which you remember is called the Corrupt 90s.
Oh, yeah.
And this particular character that we met back then is Sheriff John Fleming.
Okay.
The county had been providing $2 a day to pay for an extra jailer, but Sheriff Fleming had been pocketing all that money for himself.
Okay.
Okay, so to start, just remember that corrupt Sheriff Fleming was in charge of the jail where Elizabeth was taken.
Okay.
no.
And in fact, Sheriff Fleming himself is the person who arrested Elizabeth and took her into custody. Now, I have a copy of his invoice for those services. Sheriff Fleming charged 25 cents for making the arrest.
Wow.
$3 for conveying Elizabeth to jail.
Oh.
$1.40 in mileage.
Okay.
Now, in what kind of a vehicle? And $1.50 for attending court. So that's 25 cents plus $3 plus $1.40 plus $1.50, which by my calculations comes out to $6.15.
That's adding up now.
But in Sheriff Fleming's math, he puts all those things, itemizes them, and then his total is $6.45.
Oh,
Okay.
no.
And that's what he charged on his invoice, and I'm sure that's what he got paid. So yeah, 30 cents difference, but 30 cents here, 30 cents there.
Right.
That can add up if you only
Yeah.
get 25 cents for making an arrest,
I know.
True.
right? So good scam, Sheriff Fleming.
Yeah.
Anyway, that's just to remind you that Sheriff Fleming is back in our picture now.
Right.
Now, something was going on at the exact time of Elizabeth's arrest, and it is not by chance that these two events coincided.
Ooh.
So William Carson's daughter was getting married at William Carson's house, and it was a very big social event. Anybody who was anybody in Eau Claire society would have been at the wedding. One person who was not at the wedding was District Attorney William Frawley, but we'll get to that. So while the big wedding is happening at the Carson's house, Elizabeth is at that very moment being carted off to the county jail. Here's an account of what happened next from the local newspaper. And yes, this is from the newspaper, but I will tell you that Frawley himself later testified to the truth of what you're about to hear. So Elizabeth arrived at the jail at 7:00 p.m. About 8:00 p.m., a strange man, well-dressed and about 35 years of age, called at the jail and inquired for Mrs. Russell. He was admitted and at once engaged in conversation with her. The man told Elizabeth that he was an attorney from Rice Lake, Wisconsin, and that he was on his way to Chicago to engage the best legal talent to defend her at her upcoming trial. According to this man, he had just come from the Carson wedding, where he had met Elizabeth's attorney, Mr. V.W. James. He said that Attorney James had engaged his services and asked him to call on Elizabeth at the jail and get the material points of her defense, and that she was to tell him all that she knew, which apparently she did. They talked for about 20 minutes and the man left. At 9:30, though, he returned, telling Elizabeth there were just a few more points he needed to discuss and that he could catch the 10:30 train to Chicago. At this point, Elizabeth started to smell a rat, or as a newspaper said, smelling a mouse. Mrs. Russell was not quite strong in the belief that her visitor was acting in good faith. And apparently she said as much to this mystery man. So the visitor told Elizabeth that she could use the telephone at the jail to call Mr. James at the Carson house to verify that the visitor was legit and that he was telling her the truth. Now, I'm just going to pause here for a second. Remember, this is 1891.
Who connects the calls? Is that what we're thinking?
What I'm thinking is
Okay.
the telephone at the jail. Alexander Graham Bell's first telephone call took place in March 1876. So telephones, they were not very old, right? So they said, yeah, you can use the phone here at the jail. You can call Mr. James, your lawyer, at the Carson house, and he'll tell you that everything's okay. And that's exactly what happened. So the jailer calls up the Carson house, gives the phone to Elizabeth, saying that Attorney James was on the other end. Elizabeth then spoke to Mr. James. He told her all was well, and yes, the visitor was there to help her, and she should tell him everything. Then the call ended. Elizabeth and the visitor spoke for a while longer, and then the visitor again departed. Elizabeth later said to the jailer on duty that she felt much better, and now she could rest more easily. A few minutes later, though, Attorney James showed up at the jail.
Uh-oh. And he never talked to her on the phone, right?
There you go.
I mean, I was going to say, does she remember what his voice sounded like?
How would she even know?
Things weren't that clear back then, you know?
That's what I was going to say.
Exactly.
Terrible.
She's getting scammed left and right.
So Mr. James had been at the wedding, but he had not talked to anybody about the case, nor had he
Oh,
enlisted anyone's services. According to the newspaper, Mr. James was dumbfounded when he found that his client had been unbosoming herself to someone sent to extort information from her. I thought you'd like that word.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with that term.
I had not been either, but apparently when you share a lot of information, back then it
You're
was called
unbosoming.
unbosoming oneself.
I guess it's like get it off your chest.
Exactly.
Bosom yourself.
I'm gonna use
I'm
that
gonna say
phrase.
that tomorrow at work. I think someone would send me to HR.
So, of course, now Elizabeth totally freaked out. According to the newspaper, she raised her hands over her head and cried, "My God, my God, my God, I have ruined myself. I never can clear myself."
Poor Elizabeth.
So the whole thing was a trick masterminded by, drumroll,
Frawley.
District Attorney William Frawley. The well-dressed stranger was working for Frawley, and his name, anyone?
Whipple.
Was
Whipple.
Russ Whipple.
Yay!
Oh!
Frawley probably was seeing this career-building case going right down the drain because there was no evidence. So he concocted the entire scheme of arresting Elizabeth during the wedding and having her taken to jail so Russ Whipple charade could go down and hopefully extract a confession.
Wow.
Now, going back to another earlier episode, do you remember that we learned that William Carson's house was the first in Chippewa County to have plastered walls?
I do remember that.
Well, that might have been true, but one thing William Carson's house did not have was a telephone.
Oh.
Ooh,
Oh.
wow.
All right. That's a big fact to leave out.
Mr. Whipple is putting himself at risk here.
And so Sheriff Fleming was obviously in on it because the jail had to know who to call
Oh,
Yeah.
right.
and exactly what lies to tell Elizabeth.
Oh, wow.
Wow. This is dirty.
But who was on the other end of that line posing as Attorney James?
Whipple?
It was Frawley himself.
Oh, wow.
Wow. That's bad.
He did it himself.
That is bad.
Yeah. And he admits this later? Is that what you said earlier?
Oh, yeah.
Wow. Is that like the definition of entrapment?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
It's not okay.
That's for sure. This is juicy tonight. I'm excited.
This Frawley guy, man.
He's bad.
He is bad.
I just can't believe how blatant he is. Unbelievable.
Yeah, really.
But he wasn't embarrassed. So this became public pretty quickly. And far from being embarrassed, Frawley seemed just proud of his own brilliance. There were newspaper headlines saying, "Russell confesses," which I'll tell you right now, she did not. She had not
Yeah.
confessed.
Right.
And we'll talk about what she might actually have said next time, but she did not confess. Anyway, the newspaper didn't care. It sold more papers if she did. So they said, "Russell confesses." And the articles were saying essentially, what's the big deal? If she had nothing to hide, no harm. And if she's guilty, justice was done. Yay, Frawley.
Oh, boy.
Oh, that's terrible.
Listen to this. This is from a newspaper article. Notwithstanding the fact that some severely criticized the person who planned and arranged the conversation with Mrs. Russell at the jail and over the telephone, many of our citizens compliment that person in endeavoring to obtain the true facts in this case. And those people further say that if Mrs. Russell was in no wise connected with the murder of Mrs. Erickson, she could have sustained no injury or damage by those interviews. What constitution?
Yeah, right. Right.
Terrible.
At this point, Elizabeth Russell was heading to trial in a case where the prosecution had already secured countless unfair advantages.
Mm-hmm.
So let's go over who the main players are going to be at the trial. So the judge would be the Honorable William Francis Bailey, Judge Bailey.
And we haven't heard of him before, right?
Well, hang on a sec. Just see if he rings a bell. Judge Bailey was another Yankee from New York.
Okay.
He claims to have been admitted to the bar in Brooklyn in 1863, which is a little bbit hard to understand because that was smack dab in the middle of the Civil War, and his bio also says that he served as a captain beginning in 1862.
Sounds like he embellished his resume.
Possibly so. Maybe we're just missing a piece of the puzzle. But here's a point of interest, and maybe you remember, since you asked, had you met him before?
Right.
In our very first episode, I referred to a 1914 book called History of Eau Claire County, Wisconsin, as being the source of some of the information I had gathered about William Carson. And then, you might recall, it turned out that most of that information was complete bunk. Judge Bailey was the author of that book.
Okay.
Oh, I can remember that.
After the Civil War, Bailey made his way from New York to Wisconsin, where for 2 years he served as district attorney in Eau Claire County.
Okay.
His bio skips over the part where, as a New York lawyer, he got admitted to the Wisconsin bar, but we'll just maybe assume that happened. Although, considering Frawley became district attorney, it kind of seems like Eau Claire County was not super exacting in its standards for who became district attorney. Bailey was then twice elected mayor of Eau Claire. He first became a judge in January 1892, and that's important because that was only 3 months before Elizabeth's trial began.
Okay.
So we're not talking about a super experienced jurist presiding over this trial.
Okay.
It might have been his first. Okay, so he's the judge. The district attorney would, of course, be William Frawley. But there's one thing Frawley overlooked in all of his dastardly planning. He was still only 3 years out of law school and he had no experience. Oops. So Frawley needed help. So he convinced the county to engage a well-known criminal lawyer from Minnesota whose real name was W.W. Irwin, though Mr. Irwin was more frequently called the Tall Pine Tree of the Northwest.
How tall was he?
Apparently quite. So Mr. Irwin would assist Frawley in conducting the trial. Now, Elizabeth's lawyer, who we just met, Mr. James, would be on his own. And his first act was to say, wait a minute, don't lawyers have to be admitted in Wisconsin to appear in Wisconsin courts? And the answer is yes. Yes, they do.
Okay, that's good to hear.
And Mr. Tall Pine Tree of the Northwest was not admitted to practice in Wisconsin. So Mr. James brought a motion to prohibit Pine Tree from appearing in the case and assisting young Frawley.
Okay.
Judge Bailey denied the motion.
Oh, wow.
All right, anybody come on in.
Pretty much. So Pine Tree was allowed to sit at the prosecution's table to examine witnesses on behalf of the state. Essentially, he was the district attorney.
Oh, wow. So he took the lead.
Yeah.
Wow.
So the trial was to begin on April 18th, 1892, and holy cow, did it sell newspapers. But the trial didn't actually begin when it was supposed to. Well, here's an early article which kind of sets the stage for how the whole thing was going to play out. An anxious and expectant crowd awaited the arrival of His Honor Judge Bailey Monday morning at the courthouse, eager to hear and see the proceedings in the already celebrated Russell poisoning case. Whispering and talking in low tones could be heard about this case, and the sympathy in general was with the accused. That surprised me, because that's the first we've heard that
Sympathy for the accused.
that anybody gave a crap about Elizabeth.
Yeah.
Anyway, according to this article, the sympathy in general was with the accused, who sat with her husband, Tom Russell, in the courtroom and appeared calm and rather unconcerned. I like this part. Although her face showed that something was weighing on her mind. After a few minor matters were disposed of, the judge asked W.H. Frawley, attorney for the state, if they were ready to proceed, to which the district attorney replied, no. It turns out that one of Frawley's main witnesses wasn't able to show up until some other date. And I mean, in a normal course, a lawyer would just ask for like some kind of accommodation
Right.
and just say, this is the situation. But instead, Frawley, he couldn't take any responsibility. He wasn't mature enough to know how to act. And apparently on this point, Pine Tree was not helping. So Frawley tried to blame it on Elizabeth's lawyer, Mr. James, who had absolutely nothing to do with it. And a courtroom battle ensued. And the trial hadn't even begun. Here's how the newspaper described it. Finally, the judge put a stop to the discussion and advised the two gentlemen to reserve their energies for the trial as they would need it all. The judge then very emphatically said that the case would not postpone again and that it would come up for trial next Monday morning, the 25th of April, and that if the witnesses were not all here, the case would be dismissed.
Okay.
So Bailey's like, get it together, Frawley.
All right. Well, that's good.
And then the next week, they tried again. Everybody showed up and they moved forward with picking a jury.
Oh, okay.
And nobody wanted to be on that jury.
I bet.
Not a huge town, right? So you have to choose the pool of jurors from that area, right?
Exactly.
Then what happens?
Well, the newspaper described the jury situation this way. A feeling of intense relief was felt by those who feared the calling of their names. There was manifest all day a reluctance on the part of the jurors examined to serve on the case. No other case in the history of Eau Claire County has been marked with such interest, and no other case has been talked over and written about as has this one. Eventually, though, 12 people were chosen, all men, of course, and Judge Bailey instructed them as follows. They were to converse with no one about the trial, nor allow themselves in any way to be approached by outsiders. The case they were engaged on, he said, was a capital one, and though perhaps a hard matter, they must remain under the watch of the sheriff when absent from the courtroom. That's laughable because remember who the sheriff is.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. How much will he charge for that?
Yeah, I know. Big bill.
They will eat and sleep at the Hart House. So they were being sequestered and were marched there upon adjournment of court under the care of Sheriff Fleming. In their hands, says the newspaper, rests the fate of Elizabeth Russell. So, we'll see next time that the newspapers reproduce pretty nearly exact transcripts of all the witnesses' testimony every day. And that has been my main source of information because an official transcript doesn't seem to have survived.
Okay.
So I have been using the newspaper transcripts.
Have you found that there are several newspapers and some willing to print what seems to be fact more than sensationalism?
For some of these articles, absolutely, yes. But for the transcript, it was just the one local paper. And other papers around the state would take little excerpts from it.
Okay.
But the trial testimony transcript, from what I can see, tended to just be in this one local paper.
So do you think the real transcripts were just destroyed, like somehow, like a accident, or did they just not take them?
I don't know. The Wisconsin Historical Society said anything that would have been retained in this matter would have been in those archives, and they didn't have a transcript. That doesn't mean it doesn't exist someplace else.
Right.
It would have been, frankly, way easier if I had a complete transcript. I had to piece it all together from these newspaper articles.
Wow, that's wild. Probably the judge has it or had it. He probably wanted to write a book, or the sheriff.
Sheriff probably sold it.
Yeah, he probably did.
My plan next time is to look as objectively as possible. I know sometimes we've swayed and shown, or I have, like my opinions and
Well, it seems like it's hard not to, though.
but what I'd like to do next time is look at the evidence, all of it, and be as objective as we possibly can,
Yes. We'll come in like the juror ourselves.
but not under the care of Sheriff Fleming.
That's right.
Honestly, a lot of the testimony and the evidence we have already discussed because I needed it to give you the facts for leading up. So you've already heard a lot of the testimony.
Yeah, it is crazy though. Like I'm still thinking like what evidence could there be?
There are plenty of things you haven't yet heard.
Okay, good.
Oh, all right.
Mysteries to be solved.
I want to know what happened to Whipple.
You'll find out.
All right.
All right. Thanks, guys. We'll see you next time.
See you next time.
Doppelnamers is a production of Harriet's Guides, LLC. Our theme music was composed and performed by Mary Jean Stead, orchestrated and arranged by Janine Lynn Claps. The Doppelnamers logo was designed by Kay Lum. Thanks to my co-hosts, Mary Jean Stead and Kathy Boyle Almeida. Thanks to the Wisconsin State Law Library, the Wisconsin Historical Society, the archivists at the University of Wisconsin-Eau Claire, and the University of Wisconsin-La Crosse. Take care, Doppelnamers.